Warning: this is a scary story which involved someone committing suicide. Some details can be a little graphic. Thank you and enjoy the story. In the mid-90s, my family and I were into farming and raising chickens, so we moved into a house in Sanger, California. It's still located in Fresno County, but Sanger is an old town with many houses far apart from each other. The house that my family lived in this story is very old. It was built over 100 years ago and is surrounded by a lot of farmland and trees. When we moved into this house, my grandpa had already passed away a while back. In this house, my father must have known that something was going on, and at night, it was pitch black outside, so he wouldn't let anyone go out. If we had trash to throw out, we would just sit the trash by the door and throw it out the next day. At the time, my father would stay up late because strange things would happen. Sometimes something would scare the chickens in the coops. My father would go out with my mother to check on things and make sure it wasn't a snake, fox, or coyote. Us kids didn't know it at the time, but later when we were out of the house, my mother told us that someone would always knock on our door at exactly 2 a.m. every single night. My parents' bedroom was very close to the front door, so when someone knocked on it, my father would hear it. Because he was a very light sleeper and always slept with one eye open, because he was always worried about his chickens. One night, my father listened closely as he heard someone opening the door. He looked at the clock, and it was only 1:45 a.m. He stayed put, and there was a knock on the door at exactly 2:01 a.m. Right after the knocking, the chickens started going crazy in the backyard. My father grabbed his shotgun and woke up my mother. They both got to the front door and it was closed but not locked. My father told my mother to check on us kids because he didn't know if something got in or one of us went out. My mother came to check on us while my father went out. My father ran to the chicken coop with his flashlight and almost shot my grandma. My grandma was sleepwalking and trying to get the chickens. My father saw this and thought it was something else, but luckily, he had a good flashlight and realized right away it was Grandma. When he approached Grandma, he asked her, "Mom, what are you doing?" My father asked my grandma a few times, and she kept trying to get the chickens, until my father hit her on the head with the flashlight, and she woke up from her sleepwalking. My father asked her what she was doing, and she didn't know. She then said, "What are we doing here?" Right away, my mother was calling my father from the front door and said, "Honey, the kids are sleeping, but Mom is not in her room." Then my mother saw my father and Grandma walking back from the corner where the chicken coops were. My father brought my grandma back in, and they closed the door. He then asked Grandma if she remembered opening the door, and she said she didn't. My grandma had been very depressed after my grandpa passed away. Sometimes she would mourn the loss of Grandpa. They had been together for a very long time. Grandma's sleepwalking was nothing new. She had been doing that before. She was at an age where she was starting to lose her memories, and the doctor said she did have dementia. The doctor also mentioned that people who sleepwalk tend to commit suicide, especially if they're also depressed. One day, my father went up to the roof to cut a few tree branches that had grown so long they were starting to mess with the AC unit. He used a ladder to go up onto the roof and started cutting those branches and throwing them down. He didn't have a chainsaw, he just used a knife, so it took him some time. He cut all those tree branches that were touching our AC units. After that, he came back down but didn't remove the ladder. He said not to go up on the roof because he would have to cut the other side tomorrow. That day, he just left the ladder like that. Around 9 p.m., it was already very dark outside, and my family had just finished eating dinner. My mother had just finished washing the dishes and putting them away. That's when we heard someone walking on the roof. My father noticed it and looked at all of us, and we were all inside, including my grandma. I heard my father say to my mother, If all of us are inside, then who is on the roof? During this time, my father looked a bit scared, and we kids were getting scared. My father told me to call the police and tell them that someone was trying to break into the house. I was only a little kid, so when I called, the lady who picked up the phone sent a cop right away. She then asked if there were any adults in the house, and I told her there were, but they didn't speak English. She told me to tell everyone to stay inside and not to go out. Sanger is a small town. Before we knew it, there were blue and red lights flashing outside. 2 police cars arrived, and one of the cars had this light that they could flash towards our roof. They didn't see anything, so they went around our property, and there was no sign of anyone breaking in. They came and knocked on our door and told us that they had already looked at our property and there was no one there. They asked if we were okay, and we said we were. Then one of the cops said if we had any concerns to give them a call again. After that, the 2 cops left. That night, while everyone's sleeping, my father heard someone having a hard time undoing the chain at the door. My father would hear the person open the door, but because of the chain, they couldn't open it all the way. Then the person would close the door and try to undo the chain again. My father was listening closely and then woke up my mother and told her to listen. Then they heard the door open. The metal door frame was being opened as well, since our door had that black metal door frame. My mother said to my father, "You better go check. What if it's Mom sleepwalking again?" My father got out of bed, grabbed his shotgun and flashlight. My parents both got up and went to the living room, and the door was shut tight but unlocked. My father told my mother to check on my grandma's room, so she did a quick check, and she wasn't in bed. My father went out and started calling, "Mom! Mom, where did you go?" My father went around the house to the side where the ladder was, and my grandma was halfway up the ladder. My father ran over, leaned his shotgun on the wall, and held the ladder with one hand. Then he told Grandma to come back down. My grandma was still climbing, so my father climbed a few steps, and then grabbed my grandma's ankle and shouted, "Mom!" Now my grandma started climbing back down. My father got back down to the floor and used the light to make sure my grandma could see her steps. But when my father flashed the light up towards my grandma, she looked down at him, and my father said her face appeared to be black and blue with some swelling. Once she got back down, my parents assisted her back into the house, but she was still in her sleepwalking. She wasn't completely awake yet. My grandma's face appears normal again. Sometimes when you try to stop a person from sleepwalking, they won't listen and are very strong. My parents had to pull my grandma back inside the house until they could close the door. Once inside, my grandma walked back to her room and went to bed as if nothing happened. It was so strange. The next day, my grandma did not remember anything. That day, my father went back up to the roof and cut the branches on the other side. Then he got back down and put the ladder away. That night, we did not hear anyone on the roof. However, according to my father, almost every night, someone would come knocking at our door at exactly 2 a.m. My father would go, look through the little peephole in the door, but didn't see anyone outside. Then he would walk back to the bedroom, and it would knock again. Like I said, when we lived in that house, my father wouldn't let us go outside at night. It's as if he knew something. My parents thought that my grandma was acting weird. She was very old, but was acting so weird that they wanted to consult a shaman in the community. That week, my father made a phone call to our relative that lived in Sacramento. We didn't have many relatives here in Fresno County, and most of the ones who knew Hmong culture and traditions were in Sacramento. The shaman grandpa that my father consulted told my father that he was available and could do a ritual on Saturday. That day, my parents went to buy stuff from the store, and it was just us kids staying home with Grandma. My grandma was so weird. She would come and watch TV with us kids. She did this multiple times. Then she went back into her room. After a while, I heard her calling me, "Kang, Kang." I went in and said, "Grandma, did you call me?" Grandma did not answer. She did not look at me but was just staring at my grandpa's picture in the glass frame and running her hand over it. I repeated, "Grandma, did you call me?" She didn't say anything or look at me, so I went back outside into the living room. I was watching TV with my siblings when we all heard Grandma call me again. I went back inside and asked her the same thing. "Grandma, did you call me?" This time she was kind of sobbing silently as she ran her hand over my grandpa's picture. I stood there and watched her, and then I could kind of hear her silently mourning, like she would mourn a dead person. I couldn't tell what she said, but it was something along the lines of, "Why won't you come and take me too?" I got a bit creeped out by her sobbing and mourning, so I went back out to the living room. My siblings and I were in the living room when we heard a door slam. It was Grandma's door. I don't know what took my parents so long, but they did say that after they went shopping, they were going to pick a pig at a Mexican farm and have it killed on Saturday morning for the shamanic ritual. That pig farm is far away on the other side of town, on a road called Grantland Ave. Around sunset, my parents came home. They brought a lot of stuff, including plates, cups, utensils, napkins, and sodas. They also bought some food for dinner. My parents rested a bit, and we kids were playing in the other living room. Once the sun went down, my mother set up dinner on the table, and my father told my sister to go tell Grandma to come and eat. My sister went and then came back and said Grandma locked her door. My father said for her to call Grandma, thinking she might be sleeping. I got myself a plate and started eating. I could hear my sister calling Grandma loudly in the hallway. Then she came back to tell my father that Grandma didn't answer. My father got up to go knock on the door. He tried the handle, and it was locked. He called, but Grandma didn't answer, so he came back to the living room and found a penny. Our bedroom doors are the kind you can open with a penny or a coin. My father went to the door, and before he unlocked it, he looked up and saw a knot on the door. It was like a piece of cloth tied into a knot. Right away, my father knew my grandma had hung herself. He quickly opened the lock, and the moment he opened the door, my grandma fell onto the carpet, and her face was already blue. She was gone. My father started calling for my mother. My siblings and I got curious, so we went to the hallway to see what's going on, but my father yelled at us not to go any closer. My grandma had used a long dress, where she cut the dress, tied a noose on one side and tied a knot on the other. She put the knot over the door and closed it, then hung herself. Before the funeral, the shaman actually did a ritual to see why my grandma did that to herself. According to the shaman, my grandma told him that some people came and told her that they would take her to see Grandpa, and that's why she did that to herself. Once the funeral was over and it was just us family, the knocking at the door at 2 a.m. continued, but this time it was Grandma. Both my parents could hear my grandma calling them after the knocking on the door. "Son, son, open the door, it's cold." Almost every night at 2 a.m. there was a knocking, and then there was Grandma calling. We moved out after that. That area is between Clovis and Sanger, more towards Sanger. That house used to be on Fowler and Jensenave. After we left, I think another family moved in. But after a while, a company bought the land and the old houses there, and now it's all new houses, and across the street is Sanger West High School. That area still has a lot of farms nearby, but at one point, there were no new houses, just trees and emptied land. That's all for this video. Thank you for making all the way through and supporting my stories. Have a wonderful day or night.